The fast days on the Jewish calendar are not intended to remain fast days or days of mourning. They are all intended to become happy, joyous days, as we'll see from Asara B'Teves, the first in the series of fasts that commemorate the destruction of Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash, and its proximity always to Parashas Vayigash, how both the Parasha and the Haftarah will give us insight into what is so special about the turnaround of the fasts on our calendar. Asara B'Teves is Chol Alam or B'Smichus to Shabbos Parashas Vayigash. Always, you'll find that Asara B'Teves is Parashas Vayigash. Because the Shaloh HaKadosh tells us that the fasts are always thematically associated with the parashas that they are close to. So therefore, he's moving us to the same from Asara B'Teves to Parashas Vayigash. There has to be a link then between Parashas Vayigash and Asara B'Teves. Let's try to find out what it is. V'shloimar. As Asara B'Teves is derishon shirish von alle dalet tzeimes kidel kamen sifte zayin, because Asara B'Teves is the first of, and actually in a sense, the source of all the other fasts that commemorate destruction in Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash, as we shall see. Is the shaychus zwischen Parashas Vayigash und Asara B'Teves, the connection we're going to have between the parasha and the fast, is nit nur mitzad dem protistiken inyan von Tzeimu HaAsiri, will not only be a link to whatever the specifics of this fast of the 10th of Teves is, but not it's going to represent something about all of the four fasts and what they are all about. Because we know that the objective of these four fasts, which all commemorate things about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, is are not simply to get stuck in history, but actually to motivate the restoration of the third Beis HaMikdash. And in that case, that means that these fasts will no longer be fasts, and in fact they'll become days of joy. Using that logic, we can say, as the shaychus zwischen Parashas Vayigash und die Dalet Tzomos, the fact that there's a link between Parashas Vayigash and Asara B'Teves, and by extension the other four fasts, the nature of that link should be, will be a link to the purpose, the intention behind these fasts. In other words, the parasha and the haftarah will be linked to what these fasts are supposed to be like in their ultimate state when Moshiach comes. So, what does the parasha talk about? Vayigash is ongetayt v'bayeda seder nir nomen Vayigash. Well, if you want to know the theme of Vayigash, look at the name, which is the Hagasha fun Yehuda Yosef. It's Yehuda approaching and coming close to his brother Yosef, not yet knowing that it is Yosef. And because that's the theme of the parasha, was tefar is the haftarah from the Sedra. The haftarah of this parasha was haftarah zayna mi'inyona shel parasha, where the haftarahs are always matched to the theme of the parasha. Is wegen dem ichud von Yehuda und Yosef was vet zayin liyasid lavi. The parasha is about Yehuda making an approach to Yosef. The haftarah takes it to a whole different level. It is about the reunion of Yehuda and Yosef, which will happen in the future when Moshiach comes. Was dos is as they'll become a single unit. That is something we get a taste of when Yehuda approaches Yosef in the parasha. So what's the theme? Bringing together Yehuda and Yosef, something about the time of Moshiach. Another detail about this, the union of Yehuda and Yosef as described in the Haftarah, which is radically different to the parasha, is as follows. Even though they'll be absolutely united, we still see Yehuda is kind of singled out. That means, even though it is a reunion and a unifying of Yehuda and Yosef, as we've discussed, yet the Tanakh makes it clear in the Haftarah that Yehuda will still have a certain advantage over Yosef. That's why the Pasuk tells us clearly, the ultimate king and ruler over the Jewish people, of course Moshiach himself, will be David, in other words, from Shevet Yehuda. So there are 2 points we have to look at over here. On these 2 points, that there's a union of Yehuda and Yosef, and that Yehuda still has an advantage. And they'll both play out in the time of Mashiach. So the ichud von Yehuda v'Yosef, the union of Yehuda and Yosef. As Yehuda is the ikar, and that Yehuda is the main component of that new forged reality. Those 2 points will play out in our understanding of how these 4 fasts will be in the time of Moshiach. Where will we find that information? We're going to start with the Rambam. The Rambam brings in Sefer Tainus Dem Yud. At the end of going through the halachas of fast days, the Rambam quotes the promise As the Moshiach Mashiach that when Mashiach comes, the fast will be transformed. Lebeis Yehuda, for the house of Yehuda, they will become lesosin ulesimcha, celebratory, or lemoyadim tovim and yomim tovim, v'ha'emes v'ha'shalom ehavu, and they will love peace and love, truth and peace. And even though it speaks about this truth and peace, which indicates, of course, unity, yet the Rambam Dafka mentions specifically the house of Yehuda, which links to our point that Yehuda will have some prominence over Yosef even when Moshiach comes, and we'll explain this in greater detail. We'll talk about it. On therein, the fact that we single out the house of Yehuda when describing how the fast will in the future be Yomim Tovim is a detail that is particularly relevant to Asara B'Teves, and that also will explain later in the Sikha Kidder Kamon Sif Yud Zayin. To understand all of this, let's look at what the Rambam is actually telling us and pay attention to his words. Let's explore the Rambam. Let's review. What did the Rambam say? All of these fasts will all be cancelled when Moshiach comes. Not only will they be cancelled, they will also become holidays. Days of rejoicing, and then he brings a pasuk to prove it. This is what the Eibishter says. The fast of Shivasa B'Tammuz, of Tisha B'Av, of Tzom Gedalia, and of Asara B'Teves. Beis Yehuda will be for the house of Yehuda. That's the part that we already quoted. Be great celebration and Yom Tov, and they will love truth and peace. Where is the Rambam basing this information on? The Moker Funda Aloch is in Tosefta Seif Tainis. It's a Tosefta at the end of the Gemara Tainis, except the Gemara says things a little differently to how the Rambam does. We're going to pay attention to those differences, try and understand why the Rambam said it in the way that he did. So, Abadot is the Lashon there in the Tosefta Tainis. It says, Oisan Yomim, Asidin Yos Yomim Tovim Yisrael. Those special days, which are currently fasts, will in the future be holidays for the Jewish people. Shenemar, and he quotes the same pasuk, etc. So now we have to understand the difference in language between the Rambam and the Tosefta. Aleph. Is the Rambam mechalek the minyan in tzvei babes? How come the Rambam says this as two different statements? The Tosefta said one statement: the fast days will become Yomim Tovim. The Rambam says, Aleph kol hasidim libatel chulei. He first makes mention of the fact that they will be cancelled as fast days, and then after that, separately, Beis veloy oid. Not only that, they'll actually become days of celebration and festivity, Yomim Tovim. Why doesn't he just keep it succinct? Why doesn't he keep it as brief as the Tosefta? What were fast days will become Yomim Tovim. Obviously, it's if they're becoming Yomim Tovim, the fast is cancelled. Why does he split it in two? Next question. How come the Rambam leaves out what seems to be a really important word from the Tosefta? The Tosefta says that there'll be holidays for the Jewish people. Surely we need that word. Seeing as you're about to quote both in the Tosefta and in the Rambam, you're going to quote a pasuk that singles out Beis Yehuda and says there'll be joy for Beis Yehuda. Because the simple source of this pasuk is actually describing things as they would be in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, when there were 10 lost tribes who hadn't come back. So that's why we're describing Beis Yehuda, because those were the Jews in Israel at the time. That's why you need to say, surely, the word Yisrael, to expand that even though the pasuk says that it will be rejoicing for Beis Yehuda, it actually means rejoicing for the whole Jewish nation, including the 10 lost tribes. Why doesn't the Rambam tell us that? And one last question, Gimel, why, if the pasuk is here to tell us that fast days will become Yomim Tovim, quote the part of the pasuk that says that. Why is it relevant to know that they love truth and peace? What's that got to do with anything? Okay, let's do kushiyos. So it's possible that the two last questions actually answer each other. The fact that the Rambam doesn't say the word Yisrael, even though surely he should expand out that every single Jewish person, including the 10 Shvatim, will celebrate the Yomim Tovim that were fasts. And why does he have the pasuk for Emes V'Ashalom Mehavu? Because the Rambam does have to make it clear to us that the celebratory yontiv of what were fasts will be for all Jews. Despite the fact that the pasuk being quoted singles out Beis Yehuda. So to illustrate that, maybe that's why the Rambam quoted at the end of the pasuk that they will love truth and peace. In other words, he's alluding to the fact that when Moshiach comes, there'll be ultimate peace. Which means the ultimate peace is to take what were the two factions of Judaism, the house of Yosef and the house of Yehuda, and now they'll come together in union. And they will love the peace and the truth, obviously, but the peace which is relevant to us. That could help us understand how a simcha, which is originally a simcha directed at the house of Yehuda, will actually be a simcha for all Jewish people. Therefore, the Rambam wouldn't need the word Yisrael because the pasuk already gives us the context that at Shalom, everybody participates. Great answer, but es bleibt aber nicht moving, leaves us with a question. If that is the answer, why is the Rambam alluding to the fact that all Jews will participate in the Simcha? Why doesn't he just say it blatantly, openly, like the Tosefta does? As he takes that these will be days of Yom Tov for the whole Jewish people. We're also going to now compare the Rambam and the Tosefta to the way it's brought in Halacha in the Tur. We can ask another question. Also in the Tur, it says pretty much the same thing, but a different pasuk. It conveys the same message as we've just learned, that the fast will be cancelled and they'll turn into Yom Tovim for the entire Jewish people. Not in Tur is the Lashon, but listen to how the Tur says it. In the future, that the Eibishter will transform what were days of fasts to become days of celebration. And he brings a different, probably better pasuk. I will transform their grieving into rejoicing. And I will comfort them, and I will cause them joy where previously they had anguish. Isn't it? Move on. So now we have a question about the Rambam. What is the Rambam quote the pasuk from Zechariah, which is a pasuk, as we've already mentioned, that on the face of it is actually describing how things would be in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, not in the time of Moshiach. And that pasuk did raise an issue for us because it seems to single out Beis Yehuda instead of the entire Jewish people. The Rambam could have avoided all of this trouble by quoting the same pasuk as the Tur. He could have quoted the pasuk that says, I will transform their mourning into a jubilation, which is clearly talking about the time of Moshiach. And it definitely conveys the message more clearly, no? So now that we have noted the differences between the Rambam and the Tur, Aleph in Rambam, and in Tur Ein Bava, the one which we already mentioned before, that the Rambam splits the process into two, cancelling the fasts, and then independently of that, making the fast into Yom Tov, whereas the Tur just says they'll be transformed into Yom Tov. Beis and Rambam bringt the pasuk koyamash gomer same gomer you gomer sasan gomer on in Tur den pasuk vafachti gomer sein gomer, and also the fact that the Rambam quotes a different pasuk to the Tur. Those seinen tolu zebozeki come on. The reason for these two distinctions is because in the Rambam splitting his description of how the fast will be shifted when Moshiach comes, by splitting that he's giving us key information, and that key information will actually resolve all the other questions we have about the Rambam. So let's understand wird man das verstehen durch Mavor sein dem Chelek in Teichen zwischen die zwei eben demante Pesukim. Our starting point is, let's understand the difference between the pasuk from Zechariah that the Rambam quoted and the pasuk from Yirmiyah that the Tur quoted. Once we understand the difference in their messaging and their content, it will help us understand where the Rambam is going, which is really going to be our focus. We're talking about what's going to, the psukim where he gomer sasan gomer vafachti gomer. So the one is saying, it's going to become days of joy, and the other is saying the hafachti is going to be transformed into joy. Now, it might sound like we're splitting hairs. Those are really important distinctions. In order to understand that, we have to analyze that there are three different things that will happen in the process of turning fast days into Yom Tovim. Aleph, the first is die tzomas werden botel werden. Obviously, the fasts themselves will be cancelled. We'll no longer fast on Tisha B'Av. Das heißt, wie bald das Dämmel wird sein am Matze von Yesholem, wird Botter werden der Chiyuv zu fasten. So because there'll be this global peace, there will no longer be a requirement to fast. With the psak as Yesholem is ein misanim, like the psak, the halacha is that when it is a time of global peace, in other words, when we have removed all of the pain for which we're fasting, obviously we don't fast. That's phase 1. Cancel the fasts. Phase 2 is not only will those days no longer be fast days, but they'll actually become days of rejoicing. And it's quite logical, because if a person's been in a difficult position and now they're relieved from that position, if they're living under decrees of the kingdom, in Golos, without peace, now suddenly things are good, there's this tremendous sense of relief, obviously you'll be joyous. So, in the same way as we no longer have to fast because the world is good, we will naturally be joyous because the world is good. But then there's a third component which is much more radical, Gimel. Not only were the dates on the calendar that used to be assigned to fasts now be assigned to celebration. Now, Nochmer, it's far deeper than that. The inyan hatzoim gufa, the concept of what a fast is, what that day is all about, will become a source of joy. Similar to what the pasuk tells us in Yeshaya, that when Moshiach comes, we'll be grateful to the Eibishter for the distress he placed on us. The cause and reason for our gratitude will be what was previously the cause of our pain. The cause and reason of our simcha and celebration will be what previously was the fast day. Let's understand that, and in order to do so, we're going to remind ourselves that the purpose of a fast is not to mourn, it is to encourage us to tshuva, as the Rambam says clearly. Tshuva also has 3 important stages to us, which will align with the 3 stages of the transformation of these fast days. Taines is medarche tshuva, who the Rambam tells us, fasting is one of the modes of tshuva. Tshuva has many channels. The one important channel is tshuva mi'ahava, where a person is motivated to do tshuva out of a sense of love and wanting to connect to Hashem, and that has 3 components to it, which are similar to the 3 ways in which the fast days will be transformed in the time of Moshiach. Number 1, Aleph. When a person has this drive to reconnect with Hashem through tshuva out of love of Hashem, it completely uproots, or to borrow a word that we've used, cancelled the averos that a person had. The avonos veren botel. That's it. The averos no longer exist. Level 1, like the fasts, no longer exist. Base, level 2. When a person is motivated to do teshuvah not out of a sense of fear, not out of a sense of regret, but out of a sense of enthusiasm and passion to connect to Hashem, that person will end up doing many, many more mitzvahs, many more ma'asim tovim. So the net result will not just simply be the removal of the bad, but because of the process of trying to mitigate that avera, the person is going to add more good, more positive. That's like saying the day that used to be a Yom Tov is now designated on the calendar as a day for extra simcha to compensate for the Yom Tov, for the fast. Gimel, the third state, is durch tshuva mi'ahava, the ultimate state of doing tshuva out of love of Hashem, is doinos nasa loikazochios, the original wanton transgressions now are counted as merits. Besides the fact that the person will add new, fresh, additional mitzvahs as a response to their tshuva. But the ultimate state is what was previously called an avera, the content of that action was an avera, is now considered a credit, a merit, because it motivated this tshuva. That's like the day that was a fast day. Now the same motivation of what made it a fast day originally is the reason it's a celebration today. Because we know in order for Moshiach to come, the Rambam tells us, we as a Jewish nation have to do tshuva. So therefore, the 3 elements of tshuva will reflect in the 3 ways that the fasts, which are a representation of Gula, will manifest. Als das wird aufgetan durch der Schleimes Tshuva von Iden, Tshuva mi'ava, in die drei Inyonim Sheba. We go through the three phases of Tshuva mi'ava, and it causes the three phases of reversal of the fasts and replacement of the fasts. Damit can verstehen hat mir Klolis in der Halacha von Rambam. With that information in mind, we can address what actually is a very generic but important question about the Rambam. And Azaya and Turva Shulchan Aruch, in fact, it's a question we can apply to the Shulchan Aruch too. Der Teichen von Sefer Yad HaChazak is B'Leshon Rambam in seiner Akdoma zum Sefer HaYad Alochos. We know that the Rambam's objective in writing the Yad HaChazak, as he himself tells us in the introduction, that's the same objective with the Torah and Shulchan Aruch, is to teach us halachos. And if this is a book of halacha, we need to understand what's the halacha in the fact that there's a promise that when Moshiach comes, the fast will be replaced by Yom Tov. In Rambam, perhaps in the Rambam, we have a ready answer. Because one thing the Rambam does, which is unique in the Yad HaChazaka, is addresses halachic issues that will only be relevant in the time of Moshiach. And maybe this is relevant in the time of Moshiach, that there'll no longer be fasts. That's a halacha. But that would not explain why the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch would speak about the fasts and their status in the time of Moshiach. Those are not books that address halacha in the age of Moshiach. Why is it relevant for us in halachic terms to know that these fasts will be neutralized when Moshiach comes? Is the bi or bozes explanation is the mitzvah muvur vi azoy sedav zayin ataynes. It's part of the halacha of how you fast, what fasts are, how we approach a fast, how we actually experience the fast. The tshuva fundem taynes uchenala as ataynes medaki tshuvahu. A fast is primarily about tshuva, as the Rambam pointed out. Therefore, Dav Zayin Azar Oifen halacha tells us what kind of tshuva has to be associated with the fast. The Rambam and even the Torah and Shulchan Aruch are telling us the halacha is what kind of tshuva do you have to do on a fast, the kind that will turn the fast into a Yom Tov. Now we can understand das is the Chelek in Teichen zwischen die zwei Psukim, the difference between the two Psukim that could potentially be brought to illustrate what's going to happen to fasts when Moshiach comes. The pasuk the Rambam quotes about how these days, and he tells us the dates on the calendar, will all be turned into days of rejoicing. Red Vegan di Yemei Hatzoim is describing the days that are currently fast days, as di Teg Velen Zayin Yomim Tovim, that in the future these days will be Yom Tovs. Das heißt, in other words, besides the fact that there will no longer be fasts. This pasuk is highlighting days that were originally designated as fasts. Those days will become days of Yom Tov. Whereas the pasuk the Torah quotes from Yirmiyahu about transforming our grief into jubilation, that is not describing the days, it's describing our feeling of grief. Then in place of the sentiment of mourning and grief, we will have the sentiment of joy and rejoicing. Why would we draw that distinction? The pasuk from Ba'isheni Kanal Sif Gimel, as we already mentioned, the pasuk in Zechariah, which the Rambam quotes, is actually describing how things are in the second Beis Hamikdash period. And we know that the second Beis Hamikdash was lacking 5 key elements. So there's no question that during the second Beis Hamikdash, it wasn't a complete transformation of the fasts into joy. Whereas the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, which says our mourning will be transformed into joy, that's describing the time of Moshiach. Where everything's going to be perfect, the Beis Hamikdash will be perfect, the Geula will be perfect, and therefore the transformation of the fast into Simcha will be perfect. So, for the Rambam's purposes, he wants to bring the pasuk from Ba'isheni, even though it wasn't a complete transformation, because he wants to tell us the transformation has to be the days themselves, not just the mood. Rambam bring the pasuk With this, we can understand, yes, the Rambam is bringing what appears to be a weaker pasuk because it's talking about the second Beis Hamikdash and not a complete transformation of negative to positive. You would have expected the Rambam to quote the pasuk in Yirmiyahu that the negative is transformed into positive. Because it describes a far more advanced transformation of grief into joy than the pasuk the Rambam does quote. So why does the Rambam quote that pasuk? Because the Rambam's intention is not just to tell us that dates on the calendar previously allocated for fasts will now be times of Yom Tov. The Rambam wants us to know the date that was a day of fasting as mandated on the calendar. The nature of the day will change to become a day of simcha. V'habira meaning, the inyan von Hasidim Yosem Tovim Chulei kommt in Rambam als Hemshach zum Friedigen Fall. So that's why the Rambam is telling us this concept of fast days becoming Yomim Tovim as a follow-up to what? He tells us stage one is all the fasts will be cancelled. Then he says, not only that, but they will also be transformed. In other words, the Rambam is making it clear to us the fact that these fast days will become Yomim Tovim is a whole new experience, a whole new phase, a whole new revolution that is far greater than the fact that they'll be cancelled from being fast days. And you can hear it in his language. Not only that, I'm going to tell you something even more amazing. The Rebbe Kemen is sagen, dass der Rambam meint, damit Bloi ist das, was die Tag werden Yomim Tovim. When the Rambam is making such an exaggerated statement, but wait, there's more. He's obviously not just saying dates that used to be fasts are now dates allocated to Yom Tov. Because as we've already mentioned, cancel the fast, we're already besimcha. But that's human nature. If there is something that creates anguish and it's now resolved, it's removed, we are now happy on the day that previously was associated with pain. That's not the Rambam's innovation. So therefore you have to conclude as mitten uftu von veloi oid ela chule. By the Rambam using such extreme language, not only are they cancelled, but more than that, it's because the Rambam wants us to know, not only did the date shift from being a fast to being a Yom Tov, but the energy of the fast became an energy of Yom Tov. And if then bringt die Reihe von dem Pasuk, as the etzemim von Tzoim, gomer asasen simcha v'gomer, that's why he quotes the Pasuk that he does, that the Tzoim itself is now simcha. Haraya if them, as the Pasuk Tzoim gomer asasen gomer, can get touched for an oich v'shayich seminyan Tzoim gufa, just to clarify that this is a correct way to translate what we're putting, so to speak, into the Rambam's words, that he's saying the fast itself becomes the energy of celebration. So we can understand the Gefilmen in Bach. We can find this from an expression that the Bach uses. Here's what the Bach says. Gemara asks a question from Pasuk and Al, the Pasuk that we've quoted. Kari la tzoim. You were saying tzoim achamishi v'tzoim haravi. You're calling the day a day of fast. V'kari la sasan. You're calling the same day a day of rejoicing. Pirush Haloshin and Yushav says the Bach, what's the Gemara telling us? The language doesn't add up. The mashma hu gufei sosin v'simcha. It sounds like you're saying the day of fast is itself a day of joy. Mashiyefsha, which is impossible. Sharatzim atzmei tzar yogim v'anochahu. A fast day is a day of pain and anguish. V'havalei Meimer says the Bach, it should have said. In other words, he's explaining the Gemara's question. The Gemara is asking, it should have said chodesh haravi yiyeh l'sosin. The month that previously had pain because of the fast day should become a month of joy because of the cancelling of the fast day. The month is transformed from a month of mourning into a month of rejoicing. Sagt doch the Bach, so what's relevant to us is what the Bach has pointed out. As the word tzoim, gomer, the fact that the pasuk speaks about a fast being transformed. Nit chodesh haravi gomer, rather than a month being transformed, meint the inyan hatzoim atzmoi, alludes to the fact that the fast itself becomes joyous, which is the Rambam's point. We've previously discussed in great detail that the Rambam believes that the whole messianic process is phased. As the Shita Soivel and signing them Zweite Kufis Klolias, and there are two major chapters to the period of Moshiach. Aleph, one is the Tkufah von Tchilas in Moshiach. This is the first phase of the Messianic age. Was wegen dem wird gesagt as ein ben Olam Hazeh in Moshiach le Shibud Malchus Bilvad. And at that phase, the only real difference between the world as we know it and the world of Moshiach is that we will no longer have persecuting nations. Es wird nicht bot werden in Hagel Shalom, the nature of the world won't change. And es wird dann nicht sein kin Chidush b'Maaseh Bereishis el Olam kemin Hagel Noyag. At that phase, no surprises, no miraculous change of nature. The world continues as we know it. Then the Rambam says, there will be a secondary phase or a later phase. The time when there'll be resurrection, which obviously is completely unnatural. When the natural process of the world will be completely revamped, even according to the Rambam. And there'll be new laws of nature. The only thing the Rambam says, I'm not getting into the details because nobody knows how exactly it will play out until it happens. And the Rambam says to know the information of how it's going to play out is not fundamental to our belief system. The Rebbe brings us nicht in Sefer Hayad, therefore he doesn't go into those details in the Yad HaChazaka. And with this distinction between the Rambams, we have the two chapters of how Moshiach happens, we could resolve a whole lot of questions about seemingly contradictory statements like the Rambam saying there's no difference between our world and Moshiach except for the lack of anti-Semitism and persecution, and then the same Rambam talking about Tchias HaMesim, which obviously is a change. But now we know that that's the Rambam's Shita, the Rambam's outlook on how Moshiach works. We can appreciate why the Rambam, unlike the Turin, unlike the Tosefta, split the nature of what's going to happen to the fast into two chapters as well. Because the Rambam obviously believes that there are two phases of what happens to fast days in the Messianic age, and they happen at two different stages of the unfolding of Moshiach. In the erste Tkufa, the first phase of the Messianic age, where the main difference is we live in a world of peace. Well, then there's no longer a reason to fast because we're living in a world of peace. And as we've already mentioned, the nature of societies and of people is that when a day that previously was such a bad day has been resolved, it becomes a happy day. So we'll always remember Tisha B'Av was so painful. Now it's a great day. We're relieved and we're joyous over the fact that we no longer need a Tisha B'Av. But the second concept, that fast days, which as the Bach described, are inherently days of anguish. They should now become days which are inherently days of joy. Is in the beginning from Bittul Min Hagel Shalom. That is unnatural. It does not belong in the first phase of Moshiach. And the Rebbe wird sich das dann erst in die zweite Tkufa von Yemei Mashiach. That's only going to happen later on in the second phase of the Mashiach period. And that's why the Rambam splits them into two statements. Now we still have one question. What about Beis Yehuda? What's this whole fascination with Beis Yehuda? Surely the joy of the fast days will apply to everybody. So let's go back to why it is that the Rambam quotes from Zechariah, where he speaks about joy for the house of Yehuda, instead of quoting Yirmiyah, that says that there'll be a reversal of grief for everybody. It's because the Rambam needs to discuss Beis Yehuda in this context for the following reason. What's the reason? V'habiur. Who experienced the Golus most intensely? The Malchus from Golus is by Beis Yehuda. It is Beis Yehuda, meaning to say the Jews who were not exiled by Sancherev, who actually bore the brunt of Golus. It's not something that happened to the 10 tribes. They were sent away, never seen again. Like the Piyut on Tisha B'Av, where Ahaliva, which is effectively speaking from Yehuda's perspective, says, you were moved, or you had to wonder once, and I many times. many Golios. The 10 Shvatim had one Golos, and we had many Golios. Aber bald als der Gödel Simcha von die Tzemis und Moshiach nimmt sich und ist vierch dem Gödel Asara von die Tzemis bis man Golos, because we've already mentioned a few times that the nature is when we have been in an anguished position and then it is relieved, that causes the Simcha. So the greater the anguish, the greater the Simcha that follows. The Rabbi is bringing them Gödel Simcha for the Tzemis and Moshiach. So therefore, if we want to illustrate how great the celebration will be around the fasts in the future, bringt der Rambam the pasuk hier Beis Yehuda Sosen Gomer. Therefore, the Rambam quotes a pasuk that speaks about Beis Yehuda, was damit is Mudgosh, which emphasizes as Bazei vet Sosen v'Simcha zayin in a fil gresser mos. Beis Yehuda will have the greatest joy and simcha and celebration over their release from Golus. Heyos has the kesha shivdus Bazei asachar, because they had the worst experience of Golus. No, but because the nature of the time will be everybody in unification, in union, and everybody loving peace. The two factions will reunite, Yehuda and Yosef. But the simcha from Beis Yehuda, that intense simcha, which is a natural experience of Beis Yehuda, because of the unity and the connection between all Jews will be sucked into and experience this intense simcha that Beis Yehuda has. Hagam, as Yadgosh Anal in Beis Yehuda, as the Gedel HaSimcha nimmt sich dafka mitzad Mkeshi HaShibud, was is given mer uvika by Beis Yehuda. So now this point we've just raised, which is because Beis Yehuda had the worst experience of Golus, and therefore they'll have the greatest simcha when Golus is over. Surely that's something that even applies at the second phase. Remember, we said the three phases: cancelling the fasts, the fact that naturally once the fast is cancelled, everybody has simcha, and then the transformation of the fast into a day of joy. So surely even at that second phase, because you've removed the angst, therefore there's simcha, surely the Beis Yehuda principle applies already at that point. But was größer ist der Yogen war noch von dem Zoim, als mehr ist die Simcha von dem Zoim wird Botukus. As we said, the harsher the experience of Golus was, the greater the Simcha when the Golus is over. Von deswegen, wie bald, and I'm going to bring them possibly that Goshen from Beis Yehuda, when it gets some dritten Eufen. But we now know that the Rambam, in quoting this pasuk, actually wanted to get us to the third phase of the transformation of the fast days. That the fast days will not just now be days of relief, but the fast days themselves will be days of joy. Darf man sagen? Zeg de Indian voor mij halfweg zijn dem Zoim lesossen hat a sheikhs vichetes zu Beis Yehuda dafka. There must be embedded in this message that somehow the transformation of a fast into a Yom Tov is somehow linked specifically to Beis Yehuda, and to understand that we need to understand the spiritual significance of the type of avodah Yehuda represents versus the type of avodah that Yosef represents. And this is why they're two factions, because they're two main streams of how you serve Hashem. Here's the explanation according to Chassidus. The Unterschied zwischen Yosef and Yehuda in Dargas Avodah, the distinction between the kind of avodah that Yehuda and Yosef each represent is, Yosef is in Yonoi Talmud. Yosef represents learning. Yosef means to add. When you learn something, it adds insight, it adds value, it adds in your appreciation for what you're doing. And that is all Gilei Elikus Mamayla Lamata. When we learn Torah, that is the Eibishter's wisdom from on high being revealed to us down below. Whereas in Yonah Shel Yehuda is Yehuda, which comes from Haidah, which is acceptance, Kabbalah Sol, acknowledging what the Eibishter wants. That refers to Maaseh, doing what has to be done. And that is primarily Biru V'Zikuch Hamata. When you engage in the world of action, you're primarily elevating and refining the world. One of the big differences between if your experience is Hashem shining a light, or you digging through the mess and revealing light, von der Chilukim zwischen Gila Likus Mamayla Lamata and Zikuch Hamata, when the Eibishter shines a bright light from on high, it cancels the darkness of our world. Whereas when we work through the messiness of our world to try and elevate it, we actually turn the darkness of our world into light, which is the transformation of darkness into light. The Rebbe, therefore, if we're living in the world of Yosef's avodah, all we can achieve is cancelling what was a fast day. Whereas once we engage in the world of Yehuda, we can actually transform the days that previously were fast days and make those days themselves shine, days of joy. And that also helps us to understand why it's specifically Beis Yehuda who felt the brunt of the Golus. Mitzad b'chinas Yosef, if you're living with Yosef's world, which is Gilad Kusmil Maida Lamata, revealing godliness from top down, then you can only play in an environment that has some openness, some susceptibility to goodness, to light, to being influenced. But if you live in Yehuda's world, where you're supposed to dredge out all of the goodness that's hidden inside the lowliest parts of this world, then you engage with even the darkest parts of the world. You can even turn around the worst galus in the darkest place to transform darkness into light. And to do that, you've actually got to be in those dark places. Und der Fall, was die Avodah von Yehuda ist in Mekem HaCheshach von der Mata B'Yoser, because Yehuda is operating in the place of ultimate darkness. The upside of that is, if you're working to transform the darkest of the dark into light, you have to be plugged into Hashem's essence, which is beyond the confines of darkness, and beyond the confines of that which has to or is revealed. And we see this reflected in the advantage a Baal Tshuva has over a tzaddik. As we Baal Avodah is mitzad orichuk, because a Baal Tshuva's entire approach to Hashem is trying to come back from distance, that reaches to Hashem's essence. Now, it reaches far higher than where a tzaddik could reach, because the tzaddik lives in the world of light, and in the world of light, you don't have to plug into Hashem's essence in order to be okay. And that explains the difference between the kind of geula that Yosef would have affected versus the kind of geula that Yehuda affects. Mitzad Yosef is an eifun fun yigolcha toiv. To borrow a phrase from the book of Rus, Yosef's approach is yigolcha toiv. The geula has to happen in a setting that is good and conducive. The geula has to be in a place of light and revelation of godliness. If it's not light, sorry, we can't help you. Whereas Yehuda's approach, also borrowing still from the same conversation in Rus, I'll have to personally get involved to rescue you. The geula is durchat smusa yisbarach. That is a geula affected by Hashem's essence. And that helps us understand even further why the pasuk which describes geula and the transformation of days of fasting into days of joy is specifically linked to Beis Yehuda and specifically to Moshiach. Which part of Moshiach? The second supernatural phase of Moshiach. Besides the obvious that we've already said, to change a fast into a Yom Tov is unnatural. But it goes further than that. We know that there are two, so to speak, phases of elevation that will happen in the future world. Aleph is there's going to be this big, beautiful Su'uda with this mythical fish creature and this mythical bovine creature. Which is some kind of eating and drinking, whether it's literal eating and drinking or not, various explanations. But it is associated with taking things on board, ingesting them in the way that you do when you eat. And then we have, as the description goes in the Gemara, that ultimately, Olam Haba, the Rambam brings us as well, is a place where there actually is no eating, there's no drinking, there's no physical experiences. So that's telling us about the phases of Moshiach's times, and that there are two distinctions there. Time where you eat, time where you don't. What's the difference? Eating and drinking in Olam Haba is not eating and drinking as we know it. Rather, meint der Tainug von massig sein die Taimateira was wenn damals in Isgala Veren. They are metaphoric of the fact that a person may have very personal enjoyment and pleasure from good food. So multiplying and exponentially, that's the kind of pleasure that a person will have from appreciating godliness, because he'll actually understand things in a way we've never understood before when Moshiach comes. We do Torah mitzvahs in this world in order to earn the rights to be able to have that incredible experience of godliness that's so deep and pleasurable to us. But in the second phase of Moshiach, we get to encounter Hashem's essence, which is beyond something that can be revealed, detected, experienced, described. It's not something you can grasp with your digestive system, including the intellectual digestive system. And the only way we deserve access to that experience is through having done tshuva in this world. And by standing firm in our commitment to Yiddishkeit to the point of sacrifice, which is something that we experience in Golus. That gives us an insight also into the distinction between the two phases of the time of Moshiach. The first phase of Moshiach's coming, the Rambam says, we'll be free of all the stressful experiences of our world, and we can just learn Torah. We can sit and eat and drink the wealth of Torah knowledge. Then open for Giluyim, relatable things that each time it opens our eyes and reveals something to us which makes us go, wow. But then there's going to be a second phase where the entire world as we know it is completely upended. Which is a period where there's no eating. That's where we access Hashem's essence. Und der Fall ist es so, dass wir von Beis Yehuda Shaykh zu der zweite Tkufa von Yemei Mashiach. That's why what is linked to that second supernatural essence of Hashem phase of Moshiach, Beis Yehuda. Weil die Avodah von Yehuda is Koshi Hashibut, in Koshi Hashibut the Greich, in Atzmus Yisbar Chanal, because Yehuda is getting the job done, even when the chips are down, even when the odds are against us, even when we're under tremendous pressure, we go ahead and we do it. That's what gives access to deserving Hashem's essence. So we can link this, as we said in the beginning of the Sikha, not just generically to fasts, but specifically to Asara B'Teves out of all the fasts. Because wegen Asara B'Teves steht in Avodram, if Asara B'Teves would fall on a Shabbos, we would not be able to defer it, because the description of Asara B'Teves is it's the essence of the day, which is similar to Yom Kippur. It has to be on the day. And that's why it does actually happen that Asara B'Teves could fall on a Friday, and we fast on Friday, even though you're not supposed to normally. So what does this mean? The deeper meaning is this. What is Asara B'Teves? What happened? The Tanis von Asara B'Teves is mitzadem was demot hat sich ungeben dem Motzei für Yerushalayim. Asara B'Teves marks the first siege of Yerushalayim. Was das hat ungeben in Sofsa und Sofsa der Viert in zu der spätere Gemurreis. This was the beginning of a path that will lead to all the other misfortunes associated with the other fasts. In Shivasa B'Tammuz Nifka here on the 17th of Tammuz, they breached the city. On Tisha B'Av Churban Beis Hamikdash, and on Tisha B'Av they destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. And in Gimel B'Tisha Harigas Gedalia, and subsequently on the 3rd of Tishrei, when they were under the custody of the Babylonians, they would kill and therefore have to have the fallout of killing Gedalia. But Baldazer is the mocker from Aletzoris Chulei. So therefore, because Asara B'Teves is the beginning and therefore the source of all the misfortune, that's why it's a much harsher fast with much more strict halachas than the other fasts. Weil das der Zeim von Asara B'Teves is a mocker from the alle Dalet Zeimes is verstandig. So now that we understand that Asara B'Teves is the root of all the other fasts that commemorate Churban, we can also understand as the tshuva was der Zeim ruft arois is b'yesa seis v'yesa ois with the tshuva durch the andere Zeimes must also mean that the kind of tshuva that the fast of Teves can awaken within us is the root of all other tshuva that all the other fasts could awaken. Which means that the tshuva of Asara B'Teves can drive us to the essence of Hashem more than the tshuva of any other fast. Like we said about the Beis Yehuda, because they've been through the real difficulties of Shibud, therefore it connects them to the essence of Hashem. And that's the deeper meaning of why we would not defer an Asara B'Teves that clashed with Shabbos. Because if you really analyze things objectively, the deeper meaning of Asara B'Teves is even more powerful than Shabbos itself. Why? It's similar to the so-called distress that we impose on ourselves in Yom Kippur, which is higher than Shabbos. The fasting of Yom Kippur is like the time of Olam Haba, where there's no food. It's not a lack of food, it's no need for food. You're higher than food. If the Achila is from Shabbos, therefore you're higher from Shabbos. What's Shabbos? Shabbos is a day of food. Shabbos is a day of eating, whether that be literal eating or feeding ourselves with meaningful insight from Torah. Asara b'tevis is beyond food. Und durch der Avodas HaTshuva von dem Tzem, der langt man in Atzmusi Yisborach, because the tshuva that can be stimulated on Asara b'tevis directly links us to Hashem's essence, which will be revealed in the stage of the world to come, where there will be no further eating and drinking, because we will be beyond it. And that revelation should happen to us. Teikef umiyad mamash. We shouldn't have any delays. We should see Moshiach now and go straight to this phase of Eilam Haba.